Thank you to all our patrons, but in particular, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Ashley. Thank you very much for your support. And this week's random call out goes to Jake Wiedemer. It's Not Just in Your Head is on all the social media platforms, so please do give us a follow. Alternatively, leave us a review or a rating. It all helps.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraud. Today, I want to talk to you about American happiness. What do I mean by happiness? Well, if I want to look at the dictionary definition, it means pleasure or contentment, having a sense of confidence or satisfaction with oneself and with the situation one is in. It means you're satisfied with the standards of your life and you feel lucky, you feel fortunate. I don't know if you think that describes life in the U.S. You'll have to answer that yourself. The UN does studies of world happiness, and anyone can get on the internet. We have that site here and look up the World Happiness Reports. It turns out that these are the happiest countries in the world. Note that we, the richest country in the world, are not among them. Finland is first, then Iceland, Denmark, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Norway, New Zealand, and Austria. And we should probably particularly look at Finland because that's been first for many years. And it's important to understand, why are they doing so well? Well, first of all, people feel safe. It has a very strong social safety net, something the United States doesn't have. And it includes a wonderful end to homelessness, which certainly we walk around any U.S. city, you'll see. We lack a high quality education system, which is really important on education, from everything to basic skills, to learning how to treat people, and also to learning about reproduction. And it is so close to ending its gender gap that it is the only country in the world where school-age children spend more time with their fathers than with their mothers. It's built so that people have what makes them happy, which is this combination of feeling supported, but also feeling like they have some control over their lives. And that is a description by Anu Partanen, who we cite here, who's the author of The Nordic Theory of Everything, published by Harper in 2016. And let's look at what all these countries have that we don't, and why they have the happiness we don't. Americans look for happiness. That's probably why we have more overdose deaths than anyone else in the world. In the last 12-month period, ending in April 2021, from May to April, so it's not even quite a year, we have had 100,306 opioid deaths. That's really quite amazing. We are certainly the world leaders in overdose deaths, and people take opiates because they want to be happier or they want to die. If they want to die, it's usually not a conscious thing with opiate overdoses, but it's a quest for happiness. And one of the reasons we do, and one of the ways we differ from the top 10 happiest countries in the world and the other rich countries in the world, is that we don't have a public health care system. They all have public health care, among other things. And what our, excuse me, our for-profit healthcare system, our market-driven healthcare system, means that it is the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but not the best. And it means that for even with affordable healthcare, the rates of reimbursement are low, and the period of no reimbursement is so long, and the amounts that you have to rack up are so high that Americans don't even go to the doctor often, which is one of the reasons we die earlier than these other nations. Our mortality rate of death is going up while theirs are going down. We've talked about that on this program. We've talked about the problem of Americans dying because of the four major culprits in our healthcare system: the pharmaceutical companies, the doctors who are in the American Medical Association pushing for higher rates, the hospitals, which cost a fortune and cater to whatever doctors want to charge because hospitals fill because doctors recommend them, and the insurance companies, which go right along. And one of the reasons we have so many opiate deaths, so many overdoses, is that doctors now are kind of corporatized and capitalized. In order to be a partner in a doctor's firm, you have to generate quite a bit of income for that firm. You can't spend, if somebody comes in unhappy, you can't spend a lot of time advising them on getting counseling, on doing yoga, on doing meditation, and talking to them, finding out about their problems. You have to generate a lot of patients and make a lot of money. And since opiates deliver happiness, you can give a prescription in 15 minutes or less. I had a good friend who was a psychiatrist and my referring psychiatrist when I was in practice in Connecticut. And he explained that now that they only get $300 an hour from the insurance companies, which is wildly much, but they only get 300. He stopped his hour-long sessions with patients and gives them at the most 15 minutes, so he can book at least 4 patients in that hour and be compensated at $1,200 an hour. Big incentive. As a mental health counselor, if I have an insurance client, I have to justify why I am not medicating that client. And opiates deliver happiness. Of course, they require more and more opiates as people continue, but it's tempting for doctors to deliver opiates. And when rules come down that you can't do that as easily as you used to, people go to synthetics and also non-prescription drugs like heroin. OxyContin, which was the cause of a huge wave of death and the cause of a huge profit by Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, OxyContin was worth 3 milligrams of heroin. And when people's prescriptions ran out, because most of them got hooked with prescription drugs, or at least half of them did, they went to heroin. Fentanyl, which is recently introduced, is worth 100 milligrams of heroin. It was originally an elephant tranquilizer, and it's another cause of huge wave of deaths because Americans are desperate for happiness. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies were delighted. In one little Ohio town, in 4 years, Walmart, the combination of Walmart, CVS, and Walgreens prescribed 80 million tablets of opiates, mainly OxyContin. And they're supposed to watch, but they made a lot of money. There were 400 pills per person in that small Ohio town in 4 years. And that's why that town is suing a combination of Walmart's drug facilities, their pharmacy, Walgreens, and CVS, because they were right there. The health, in quotes, corporations were right there, as were the doctors who prescribed, as were the insurers who okayed the prescription. It was a capitalist health nightmare, and it still is. And so, in a public healthcare system and with a socialistic orientation, you could not have this kind of mass death event that we've had in the United States. Let me tell you which are the 12 happiest countries according to the UN. Finland is first, then Iceland, Denmark, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Norway, New Zealand, and Austria. And I think we have to look at, how come? Why are they so happy and we're not? Well, one reason is they have control. If happiness is a combination of support and freedom, sense of controlling one's life, they have a strong social safety net, and they also have control. Certainly, they have control over their own reproduction. They all are public, give quality public health care, and they control their own reproduction. While the United States is busy curtailing abortion, they all have free abortion. Even countries that were ruled by the Catholic Church and didn't have abortion before have it now, like Ireland, like amazingly Argentina, like Chile, but we don't, and we're going the other way. They all have birth control programs that start very young in kindergarten with that if the bee doesn't pollinate the flower by taking the flower pollen from one flower to another, then the flower doesn't grow, the fruit doesn't grow. And then going on until middle school, kids learn all about their bodies and what their bodies can do. And then in high school, they learn about the relationships that they can have sexually, what those relationships are like, what they mean, how to take responsibility for their sexual partners, and for any children that might result. The birth control is everywhere. Once when I was in Sweden, I was shocked that in the ladies' room there were pictures of these, I guess they were posters that were about 6 feet high on the ceiling, not on the ceiling, but up high on the walls, that had pictures of these big smiling penises putting on condoms and saying, "I always have a condom when I go out," Whoa, that would not be a scene in any kind of ladies' room in the United States. I also was impressed when I was in Sweden, and people report this in Norway too, that every women's bathroom, because they often don't segregate their bathrooms, has a changing table, whether it's a women's bathroom or a men's bathroom or an all-gender bathroom. They also have information from the media. We don't have a big socialist media here. We have capitalist presses. If you go to a newsstand, even in the biggest city in the United States, which is New York City, 8 million people, you don't have the Socialist Daily or even the Socialist Weekly the way you do in these other countries. They also have paid vacations. The US has no guaranteed paid vacations, which makes a big difference because it's Vacations are a time to get to know yourself and your family or whoever you go on a vacation with. It's very important. They have good salaries. For example, the McDonald's workers in Denmark get $24 an hour. McDonald's still manages to make a profit, but they get $24 an hour, which would certainly help our fast food workers. And they have a conscious national goal of reaching gender equality. In Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, they stay away from gender pronouns like his and her. They call things by their name. They also encourage people to accept their own bodies. In Norway, they have speakers who are invited to speak naked, whether they're fat or thin, old or young. So kids can get used to, oh, okay, that's a body, big deal. Something we would never have with our very puritanical right wing here. And one of the things that all these countries have that we don't is an understanding of the value of kind, generous lives, not getting more money to survive. They also have very generous maternity and paternity leaves. For example, in Finland, they have 400, no, I'm sorry, it's Sweden. They have 480 days off when they have a child. And they can divide it between mothers and fathers. But that's an awful lot since we have none. In Norway, men are required to take paternity leave, so they can't get any extra credit at work for not taking the leaves that they're allowed. These give people an ability to feel good about their families, to feel supported, and that they have choices. Their birth rates are not plummeting the way ours are. The biggest development among married couples in the United States is deciding not to have children. It's too costly. The average birth in the United States, if you're not fully insured, is over $32,000. And if you are insured, it can cost as much as $6,000. Not everyone has that. So that people are supported, but they have some control over their lives. They also have some control over their governments. They all have representative government. None of them allows any private money in elections. And if somebody is found to be providing illegal contributions of money to any campaign, they are automatically excluded and punished. And they have proportional representation, which we don't, which means if you got 10% of the votes for your Communist Party, your Socialist Party, your Green Party, your Fascist Party, then you get 10% of the seats. So everybody's views are represented, which we don't have. And they're not allowed to have private money and private advertising in their campaign. So there are public events where they all present what they stand for and ask and answer questions. They are all socialist. Germany's recent election resulted in a dominant socialist government. It's a three-part government of the socialists, the Greens, and a party that's a more business party. But the wildly dominant presence is socialist. And that is true for every single one of those happiest countries. Now, why would they be socialist? Well, they're all democratic governments in that people participate a whole lot more. They all have required voting and the day off for voting. Don't have a whole party working to have people unable to vote. And they all have the choices, not only of people, but of ideologies and economies, which we don't have. We have two capitalist parties. So it's not just a person you're voting for, it's a whole set of values. And socialist values mean support for the mass of people. They mean some kind of freedom of mobility and choice and sense of control, but also strong safety nets. And so that's really a lot of why these people are happier than Americans. Americans have gone, each time they measure this, they go down on the happiness index, even though Americans are really instructed that they ought to be happy. They're also instructed, and here's where the name of this show is very important, that if you're not happy, it has nothing to do with the social conditions of your life, but rather your own poor choices or your bad family or anything that has to do with you personally, but not the society that you're living in. In these countries, if people find there's a problem, they think, okay, have I participated? What are the social roots of this problem? Because socialism teaches you that you are a social animal, not just an isolated individual. And if things are wrong, you can look at yourself, which is reasonable, but also look at the social conditions around you that could have encouraged you in that problem. And here, drugs are a great example, because in this American culture where you're supposed to be happy and most people are suffering, that's most people. 40% of Americans, before the recent postponement of it, were worried they'd be foreclosed in the next month. That doesn't make people happy. And we have the least organization of these countries, because when people feel there's a problem, they organize. So, for example, Germany has very powerful unions. One of the reasons they do, which is interesting, is when the United States Marshall Plan after World War II agreed to give Germany a lot of money, but they were not allowed, if they got that money, to allow anybody who was a communist to teach in their universities. So the communists went into the unions. And a lot of the spark of unions was from these socialists and communists who had a vision of a world where work and the people who do the work should make the decisions. Whereas we've had the opposite. Our labor unions were gutted because the AFL-CIO in the 1950s, when the House of Un-American Activities Committee condemned all communists, socialists, and fellow traveling leftists, kicked them all out of the unions. So the unions lost their energy and their spark. And so as where we used to have 35% of workers unionized in 1950, we now have, between private and public, a little less than 10% of workers organized in a powerful union. Now that's changing as Generation Z realizes they are not getting the American dream, and there's something wrong with that, and there's something wrong with their inability to get decent jobs and have a future, whether they have degrees or not. And when college debt is now the biggest form of debt in the United States, even beyond credit card debt, which is wild. All of these countries have free universities or heavily subsidized universities. Germany is unusual because it is free if you're German or if you're not German, too. But they all have highly affordable or free advanced education and child support, so that if people have children and want to go to university, they can go to the free childcare centers, which are free quality childcare centers. So if we're looking at the fact that your unhappiness is not just in your head, we can look at the UN Happiness Index and look at the top countries and realize why we are not among them, why we are dying younger every year, why we have the highest overdose deaths of anyone and increasing. And we can then, on a positive note, since this is not great news, we can say, okay, how do we get happier? And the way to get happier is to organize together and have a kind socialist USA copying all these happy nations that have what we don't. Because, of course, it's humanly possible. They're less rich. If they can have it, we can. Of course, they didn't just spend $8 trillion on a failing imperialist war in Afghanistan. So we could take a little hint from them and say, maybe we don't need to stockpile weapons. We've certainly refused to stockpile protective equipment and respirators. So maybe we could do more of those and less of weapons. Maybe we could cut the Defense Department budget since we've not had to defend ourselves in the United States. The only war we ever had on our soil was the Civil War, Americans versus Americans. So we don't need all this. We could protect ourselves very well. We have 7 times more armaments than the top other armed countries in the world. That's unnecessary. It just does fatten the wallets of the defense manufacturers, who on average made $100 billion just during the pandemic. So we could do this. The exciting thing is, okay, we can look at the World Happiness Report from the UN. We could look at these other countries that are doing so much better than we are in the things that really count, like feeling positive and hopeful, being secure and having some control over our lives. And we could do it too. That's the good news. We just have to do it. And we need to be working on it now. So that's all I want to say, but I do welcome questions. And of course, we always welcome feedback to democracy. I'm thinking of Democracy at Work, where I also have a podcast called Capitalism It's Home, to It's Not Just in Your Head. And I know that Max, Liam, and I want to respond to you. We want to get you engaged. That's why we're doing this. So are there any questions?
Yeah, I think if people want to email, it's not just in your head at gmail.com. As a general thing, I would say the most interesting thing about reading this PDF from worldhappiness.report is in seeing how these countries have coped during COVID and how the happiness index is related to that.
Yeah.
And how it hasn't changed. Like, obviously, it records dramatic changes in people's mood during 2020, but the sort of top 10 countries or the top countries didn't sort of shuffle around. And that sort of overwhelming thing that I get from reading it, certain sections, the emphasis is always on trust.
Yeah.
Do you trust your government? Do you trust your neighbors? Do you trust the general public? In all those countries that did, their sort of general well-being is much better. I mean, obviously, there's definitely some probably lots of arguments you could have over how you measure happiness, and they do go into it in the document. But it is, it's just a reoccurring theme when you read this stuff, just about the really interesting correlation was this idea of, like, if people believed that if they lost their wallet, if they believed that there was a high expectation that it would be returned, that correlated with far fewer deaths.
Yes.
from COVID. So again, it's just about, do you feel like you're in an environment where you are secure, and that parallels with, to some degree, well-being.
It certainly does. Also, one of the things that I noticed about this top 10 countries is they all have much more democratic leaders because they have a lot of choices and proportional representation. But when their leaders said, this is a terrible virus, COVID 19, we need to cooperate here. We need to trust that we will keep each other safe. We need to stay home unless it's absolutely necessary. We need to wear masks. They didn't have their leader making fun of masks like we did or denying the virus. When they had 9 cases, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who's in this list, said, "We're in this together, folks. I am closing all the barriers. I am closing every airport and entryway into New Zealand because we have to stay safe, and people returning from elsewhere will be quarantined for 14 days." They didn't have people refusing because they trust her and they trust that they're in it together and nobody's pulling a fast one on them the way a lot of people feel in America.
Yeah, well, I think, again, this sort of links back to the previous episode when we were responding to that document about why conservative Americans are afraid of socialism, because they judge a socialist government to be as untrustworthy as a sort of capitalist democracy. And so you have a sort of false equivalence. And I think, it ultimately it comes down to, well, actually, one of the sort of funny things in this document was just saying, like, one of the key things about how well you did in COVID was whether a guy or a woman was in charge.
Yeah.
in the governments. And pretty damning for all the
Yes, it
dudes out there.
is. Because there's a certain admission of vulnerability that's more common among women. We haven't been taught that we're the masters of everything. And so we don't expect to be. But there's also a sense that we're in it together because they are not as class stratified as the United States. They don't have billionaires like Jeffrey Bezos going off into space at the cost of $500 million, while homelessness is increasing wildly and people are desperate. 40 million Americans are on food stamps. Now, that's 40 million out of 330 million. And most of them are working. They're just being poorly paid. All of these countries have not only minimum wages, far higher than ours, but also maximum wages. And every corporation, even in Germany and Austria, every corporation has to have, if they are producing something, they have to have neighborhood representatives, union representatives, all those people on the board. So it isn't just that you could close a factory and leave tens of thousands of people without a livelihood, without support, without health insurance, because you can make more money somewhere else. They all have rules against outsourcing because they have the powerful socialist parties and to some extent communist parties and Green Party that don't allow this. And they're not winner take all. So if they get 30% of the votes, they have 30% of the seats in parliament. It makes a big difference.
There's also, I guess, a slightly darker version of this, which is that you could look at this league table as a problem, not only in the sense that, like, oh look, some countries are really miserable, just that I think the US is still in the top 20, and
Yeah, it's 19.
yeah, there's a lot of countries below the US and the
Yes.
UK, and it's if we are all um, an interlinked sort of global society, then the sort of darker question is: are all these happy countries benefiting from the fact that there's all these less happy countries? And I think
Yeah.
the answer, it's sort of like the resources are all flowing towards the happy countries,
The
and
rich countries.
yeah, the rich countries. And I think that obviously with the United States, it's obviously it hits hard because it's like, oh, number 19 and one of the richest countries in the world. Why isn't it up the top? But I think it's
It's the
actually
top richest.
you can go further than that. It's that are all these countries at the top there because historically they've stolen everyone's shit, and
Yes,
they
that's true.
continue to sort of ride that wave. And what do you do with this information is the sort of end game that there should be not only in your country are you looking after your own, but there has to be a sort of global perspective
Yes.
or scale on all of this. Obviously, COVID-19 would sort of show that, because it doesn't matter if you bring the case numbers down in your country because everyone's traveling everywhere all the time, and
Hmm.
yeah, you have to solve it. And it's what I found sort of fascinating, really, particularly in Britain, and watching the Conservative Party deal with the pandemic. Sort of like, again, with you had the parallel with Trump. It's like the
Yes.
worst person, the worst party to be in charge at that particular time, and just to see the clash of the ideology of capital
Hmm.
with not to sound pretentious, but reality. Like
Hmm.
the reality of this virus does not play by the same rules
No.
um, that all of our capitalist uh, democracies or states do. Um, and so, yeah, I'm not sort of ending on a positive note there, but I just think that when you put all these countries in a table, obviously the idea is like, oh, I'd hope to live in one of the top countries, but yeah, at whose expense, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, well, they all have some imperialist past. However, it did impress me that New Zealand is trying to deal with that. Jacinda Ardern, their socialist Labour prime minister, has really done a lot towards the Maori who they displaced and killed in New Zealand. That was the group that and the Pacific Islanders around them were horribly discriminated against and killed and pushed into the lowest jobs. They now teach Maori in the schools, which they didn't before. And also in her amazing care um, legislation, care work like being a home health aide, being the lower levels at the hospital, was done by Maoris and Pacific Islanders of color the way it's done by Black people and brown people here. And what she did was she measured the work that they were doing, like heavy lifting, which you have to do of patients if you give them a bath and stuff, which nurses' aides do, with other heavy lifting, and compared each of their jobs with the kind of jobs in the outer society that are paid very well. And all of the care workers, and that included social work, home health care, aides of various kinds, that included a 30.5% increase in wages for all of them because they reevaluated the importance of emotional care and physical care. Very, very important thing that she did. So, in some cases, it's being addressed. In others, like Finland and Iceland, they gave their people a choice during the last austerity period when the banks crashed. And in Iceland and Finland, they arrested the worst banksters whose crookedness had helped bring on the recession of 2008, and they gave their people a choice in a referendum. Would you like to cut back and eat more fish that we produce and other things we produce and have less imported goods? Or would you like to have some people cut their wages and be fired? And they decided, no, we'll cut back. And they recovered very well without World Bank loans. And also, they had less options of imported things. And they did well, and they decided together in a democratic way and abided by those decisions. That's that issue that you need support, but you also need to feel you need some control over your life. And it gave them control. So they didn't have the kind of mass depressions during the pandemic that some others had.
Yeah.
But you're right, they're all countries that benefited from imperialism at some point in their history. All white, dominant white countries. Even if it were far back in their histories, and even if they're trying to compensate now, there is an ugly past, which I think of particularly because in the United States, yesterday we celebrated Thanksgiving, which is really a bizarre holiday because the pilgrims, thanked the Native Americans for helping them and then killed them all. Uh-oh. Plymouth Rock, which is where the pilgrims landed, wiped out a whole tribe with smallpox box blankets.
My favorite acknowledgement of all of that was in it's quite old film now, Adam's Family Values,
Hmm.
where the kids all overrun the summer camp. Anyway, it's a bit of a left turn, but it's hilarious.
Hmm. At any rate, I think we have to think about these things because Americans have been propagandized and brainwashed to think we're the best, the best, the best. We have the best, the best, the best. No. Michael Moore had a very good movie called Who Do We Invade Next? Talking about trying to get the free education, the better penal systems, all these other things, the free healthcare from other countries, trying to conquer that and have it in our country. But we don't, because Americans have been propagandized into thinking everything we have is the greatest. No, we have a terrible healthcare system and we have very unhappy people and we're the leaders in drug addiction and overdose deaths. And of all the wealthy countries, the leaders in death. People are dying younger.
It's weird that there isn't much trust in the state, but people believe in the greatness of the states. Do you know
And
what I
the
mean?
military, well, they believe in the greatness of corporations. That's why there's this easy flow between the corporate elite and government rather than saying, wait a minute, those people should never serve, they're robbing us. No, there's this easy flow. The corporations are really efficient. Of course, they're not. And also, Americans have been propagandized ever since Reagan. Reagan wanted to counteract the idea of the big, good, great government of FDR, the New Deal, by making government the enemy and corporations the friend. So you've got to get the government out, except, of course, with big subsidies and oil subsidies and other things for these wealthy people. But, I remember seeing a picket line in the South against some government, I guess it was against affordable care, when one of the picket signs said, get the US out of Medicare. Well, get the government out of Medicare. They didn't even realize it's a government program. There is such propaganda on the right. And the Democratic Party is not a left, and it's not much of an antidote. It takes the same corporate money. And so we've been really undemocratic, and that's why we're not on the list of the happiest people in the world. We can be, we're the richest. Not all of us, of course, but we have the money in the nation, even though it isn't distributed. So it's possible. And socialism is a great vehicle, as these countries show us.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? That essentially, with something like this, that forces you, maybe is the wrong word, but makes you look at the world and how every other country is doing. That's when you can sort of step outside your bubble of your own country's issues, and you realize that there are other possibilities, and things can always be different.
They can be, and that is an inspiration to all of us. And it's not just in your head,
Yeah,
it's right
exactly.
out there.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. Thank you all. Listen, if you like the program, spread it to your friends, become a Patreon subscriber, and thank you so much for tuning in.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.